Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you ideas, patterns, how the rook and the bishop can cooperate to attack the enemy king, or even more so, to checkmate it. So let me show you the first example. Here we go. In this position, it is white's turn, and black mistakenly has just moved his pawn up from h7 to h6, attacking the white bishop. In this example, we'll see a very typical pattern of checkmate that the collaboration of a bishop and the rook can result. What's important to notice in this position is that the black king has no free squares to move to, were it his move. So therefore, all white needs to do is to attack it. And white has a simple and excellent way to achieve that right in one move. Hopefully, you could figure out the answer by now. And that is moving the rook all the way up to d8, attacking the black king, and because the white bishop from g5 protects that rook, therefore this is a checkmate. Also, by the way, the second white rook is helping out along the f-file, not letting the black king run away. Now that we saw this example, let's see a somewhat similar position and in fact an identical idea, the same pattern, but how to achieve that when there are some obstacles along the way. Here we go. In this position, the scenario is quite similar. As you can see, the white bishop and two rooks are on the same identical squares as they were in our first example. First of all, let's try to figure out what is the major difference between our previous example and this one. Well, hopefully you can notice that while the black king still has no free squares to move to, if white immediately would move up the rook to d8 as we did in our last example, then the black knight from c6 could capture that rook, and that wouldn't be fun. So let's go back to our starting position here and try to think what we need to do. Well, here we need to combine two elements, the checkmate pattern that we learned in our previous example and something called removing the guard, because right now the guard of the key d8 square is the black knight on c6. So therefore, if that knight would not be on c6, we could checkmate coming up with our rook to d8. And this is one of those rare situations where we can make an exception and willingly give up our most valuable piece, our queen, just in order to get rid of the guard of the d8 square. Well, with all these hints, it's not hard to figure out the correct move, and that is queen capturing the knight with a check. And when black recaptures, even though black has tremendous material advantage having an extra queen and an extra bishop, the checkmate still ends the game. A very nice example. Let's see a different checkmate pattern also in the collaboration of the rook and the bishop. Here we go. In this simple example, white uses the rook on b4 to take away the only potential escape squares of the black king. Of course, the edge of the board around where the black king is also helping white, preventing the black king to escape. And while we're using the rook to cut away the squares on the b files from the black king, we will use our bishop to be the actual attacker and to deliver the checkmate. And that move is bishop to c6, attacking the black king. There's no way to block the check and no way to escape. Therefore, this is checkmate. Again, after seeing this pattern, trying to figure out the solution in the next example, which is a bit more complex, shouldn't be too difficult. In this position, the black king is not yet in the corner. However, white has a way to exactly achieve the previous position. If white makes the correct first move, black will not have any other choice but to move out of the check, and then white will be ready to deliver a checkmate. Can you figure out what that move is? Well, that move is Rook h4 to b4. Black has no choice. The king is being attacked, but to move to the corner, and now we have exactly the same position as we saw before, bishop c6 checkmate. It's very important to understand that in a situation like this, we do not have the time to reverse the order of moves, because if we move the bishop to c6 first, trying to take away the escape squares from the black king on a8 and b7, with the idea to then on the following move bring the rook over and checkmate, now black would have the time to move his rook away and therefore free the c8 escape square from the king. So therefore, time is the essence. The only correct move here is to play rook to b4. And let's move on to our next example, when we are using the bishop to limit the king's escape and the rook to deliver the checkmate. In this position, we can see that the white rook attacks the black knight. However, capturing that knight would be a big miss because it would miss the opportunity to give checkmate right away. So again, this is a typical example when you need to keep your priorities straight. Namely, to attack the opponent's king, to checkmate the opponent's king, it certainly comes ahead of capturing pieces. Obviously, if you would not have the opportunity to checkmate, you should certainly capture the black knight. So, therefore, the solution here should be rook to g5. Try to remember all these patterns I'm sharing with you. As you saw, in some cases, we use the rook to be the controller of the squares and the bishop that delivers the checkmate. And then in other cases, like in this one, we reverse the roles and we use the bishop not to let the king run and the rook to deliver the checkmate. Let's see what would be the scenario if the situation is a tiny bit different. Well, first of all, let's see what is different. What would happen if white still would play rook g5? Isn't this checkmate just as well? While it's true that the black king has no escape to run away, black in this case can capture the rook, and that would certainly be an unpleasant surprise. On the other hand, now the other black knight is not on c6, but it's back on its initial square, still undeveloped on b8. Because of that, white here has the opportunity to move the rook from the other direction, namely from c8, and announce checkmate from there. Remember, if black would not have the knight on b8, the rook from the corner on a8 could capture our rook. But the knight on b8 is there, and therefore the game is over. There's nothing black can do to prolong the game. Let's see a similar situation where most things are positioned the same way, but the black knight is not on b8, and therefore the black rook in the corner indeed controls the c8 square. However, there is another difference as well in the position. namely that white got a second rook also. With all those things in the picture, white can force a checkmate in 2 moves. This is one of those tricky things that at first seems deceiving, that when one rook is behind of another, in all reality they both have control, one direct and one indirect control, sort of through an X-ray of the C8 square. What that means is that now when the white rook moves up to c8 to check the black king, after black's only response, rook takes rook, the rook will recapture and this will be checkmate. These are some of the most common ways to checkmate an enemy king with the help of a bishop and a rook. Let's see now a somewhat more unusual way that the bishop and the rook can collaborate to result in a checkmate. Here we go. In this position, again, it is white's turn, and black at the moment has a very big material advantage, still having their queen as well as 2 additional pawns. Also, the white rook is under attack. It's quite amazing, though, that white can deliver checkmate immediately here, because the rook is controlling a lot of squares that could be a potential escape for a black king. It's also amazing that white is able to checkmate here, because white only has 2 pieces left other than the king, and the black king is in the middle of the board. Typically, it's a lot easier to checkmate an enemy king when it is near the edges of the board, because then the physical limitation of the chessboard aids you, or rather takes away escape squares from that king. Well, in this case, the perfectly positioned rook on e4 does that job, as well, of course, as black's own pawns on c5 and d6. With all that said, we're ready to see what the solution is, and I suggest if you can try to figure out what the move is for yourself before you listen to the solution. The solution is to move the bishop to b7, a beautiful move that not only attacks the black king, but through an X-ray also protects the rook on e4. Therefore, the black king cannot capture the rook right now, nor can it make any other legal moves. It's game over. Let's try to see an example that kind of resembles this pattern, although the position itself will be quite different. Here we are. In this position, it is black's turn for a change. White seems to have decisive material advantage, having a queen versus a rook. Also, the black bishop is under attack right now, and if that bishop moves, then white will clearly be in a winning position. So therefore, black needs to gain the momentum and force a checkmate while he can. You'll see the pattern will be quite similar. The first move is rook f3. It's typically a good sign when your opponent's king has only one potential escape square. And in that case, it is the middle of the board, just like in our previous position. And now black is ready with a beautiful checkmate with bishop to c6. A truly amazing position. And let's see another unusual situation that we have in front of us here. There is a complete material balance, and the white bishop is under attack. Typically situations when an endgame has exactly balanced position, one rook each, one bishop each, one pawn each, and nothing serious is going on, they would end in a draw. However, here there is something very serious going on, namely that white is ready to checkmate in just one move. Again, similarly to the last couple of examples, through an X-ray, white not only will attack the black king, but also defend his bishop. Because one of the challenges right now is, for example, if the white rook would move to e1, attacking the black king, that black king could not only move away, but capture our valuable bishop at the same time. So therefore, the correct solution is to attack the king from the other side, rook to f6, where our king is guarding our rook, and the black king has no way out, including not being able to capture the bishop on d6. And let's see now another example that actually happens quite frequently in real games. Sometimes there would be a lot more pieces left on the board than here, but even this endgame demonstrates very clearly the pattern I'm trying to show. Right now, the black king has only one escape square. And if indeed black would get a chance either to escape there or, let's say, move his rook to one of the open files that has no pawns, black would be in a better position having an extra pawn. But black doesn't get the time to do any of that because white being on turn, white is playing immediately bishop h6 check. It's true that now black has two choices, not just one, move to the corner or to h7. However, after either of them, amazingly, white can deliver checkmate right away. If the white bishop would retreat anywhere along the c1 h6 diagonal, nothing significant would happen. The black king would go back to g7. However, the bishop is able to go in the other direction as well, and namely moving the bishop to f8 ends the game. Why is that? Because now this is a discovered check and the white rook all of a sudden attacks the black king. The black king has no way out. A very typical checkmate idea. Definitely try to remember this. The trickier the idea is, the more chances you have that your opponent may fall for it. Let's go on to our next example. Here we go. In this position, black has two extra pawns and at the same time is targeting our bishop, which by the way is pinned also at the same time. That means our bishop cannot move. Okay, well, that's all true, but let's see what happens if the white rook simply captures the pawn on g7. The rook is protected because even though the bishop is pinned, it still protects the rook. The king can never ever move onto an attacked square. So the king had to move to the corner. And here comes the problem. Now, if the white rook would move, let's say back on the g file to give a discovered check, it would not result the hoped goals because the black rook could simply capture the bishop that's giving the check. Try to remember this pattern. It's very useful. Here, white can give and should a double check, giving up the rook. When it's a double check, not only the rook is attacking the king, but so is the bishop. That means that the black rook cannot capture it, only the king. And what happened here is we created a very similar checkmating pattern as we learned at one of the earlier examples. So, we give up our rook on purpose in order to create checkmate on the following move. Let's move on to our next example. Here we are. In this position, it was black's turn, and black has already an extra bishop and knight. Typically, that's an easily winning advantage, and so it is here. However, no matter how advantageous, how good your position is, you always need to be careful and always look out for your opponent's threats or potential tricks. In this case, Black got careless and went for the attack, moving his queen to a4, which looks good at first. It threatens to capture White's pawn on a2 and announce checkmate, and it also attacks the White rook on d1. Looks like a dream fork. However, reality is that this was a blunder, because now White can force checkmate in only 3 moves. Again, remember the patterns we saw in the previous position and try to make that happen. White here is able to give up on his own queen, capturing the knight with a check, and when bishop captures back. This forces the Black king onto g8, and voila, here we are, the pattern we already saw in a number of examples. See, that's why it's so important to familiarize yourself with as many patterns as possible. Because if you're familiar with this and many more patterns, chances are sometime throughout your games you will have this opportunity to create these ideas in your games. So therefore I suggest you continue listening to patterns I'm showing you, as well as if you're using other books, try to absorb as many patterns in tactic books as you can. So then later on you can play for them in your own games. Or of course, avoiding the mistakes that like Black played in this game, allowing this mating combination. Let's move on to our next example, where Black has an extra knight. It's true that White has a far advanced passed pawn. However, the Black bishop on g7 is safely guarding for now the promotion square. That means if the White pawn would advance right now to a queen to get promoted, it wouldn't really achieve the goal because the Black bishop would immediately capture it. However, White has a way to win the game, and in fact it's quite important that White has this pawn on h7. The reason why it's important is because it takes away the escape square g8 from the Black king. Here again we're using our bishop and our rook to create the checkmate. White should play bishop h5, attacking the Black king. The Black king has only one legal move, and now rook to e8. Again, a very typical pattern that the bishop covers squares on the diagonal and the rook delivers the checkmate. Let me share with you another very common example that happens in games. In this position, Black has an extra pawn, and if it would be Black's turn, it would be, of course, Black playing for a win. However, time is the essence. It is White's turn, and White can force a very typical checkmate. Try to think and figure it out for yourself before you move on. And here, the elegant combination is to open the H file, capture the Black pawn on h7. Black has only one choice, king takes, and now the White bishop ideally controls the 2 escape squares on the g file, and therefore the rook h1 move will end the game with checkmate. Very pretty, very common. And finally, our last example in this lesson. Here we go. Right now, in this position, White has the opportunity to capture the Black rook and win a rook for a bishop. Typically, we would do that without thinking. But this is a great example that tells you never make a move without thinking, no matter how natural it looks. Always spend a little bit of extra time to see if you have a better move than the good one that you see. And indeed here, the optimal solution is to give a check, force the Black king onto the g file where we already have our rook as well, and then give a checkmate by bishop takes pawn. Now the rook gives a discovery check and it's game over. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you feel you have a little better idea on how to use your rooks and bishops to work together. Thank you for listening, and so long until next week.